So looking at the themes, I focus on the causal stories, so the stories that are told about what's wrong, and they focus on cultural deprivation through disruption, through colonization. Family is the root of problems, and then the solutions are cultural renewal as globalized, which is a portmanteau, obviously, of globalized and localized, mainstream knowledge, and this idea of strength through support. So the most commonly cited cause of health and social problems across documents is cultural discontinuity or disruption, followed by colonization, residential schools, and adverse experiences in childhood. And poverty, although it's mentioned, is just one of many risks that Indigenous people face. It's rarely, but sometimes is positioned as a cause, but the most common material factor cited is the remoteness of communities. And so you can see a very clear, it's just reiterated over and over, a very clear pathway of social problems, this sort of cyclic understanding that, you know, there's cultural deprivation, you were deprived of your culture by colonialism, and this means that you now lack parenting skills because you were cut off from your own mother. Really, this actually, what made me want to look into parenting was I asked my aunt, I said, you know, what's going on with the reserves? It's like a big problem years ago, and she said, well, you know, we never learned how to be mothers. And I thought, oh, that sounds a lot like mainstream parenting discourse, this idea that what parents do is deterministic of everything. That's what made me zero in on this. So it's cultural deprivation leads to a lack of parenting skills, which leads to adverse childhood experiences, which produces the social problems. And while there's some Krista Maxwell criticizes the parenting culture associated with Indigenous people for this outdated cycles of abuse model that's used implicitly. There's less criticism of this cultural deprivation theory. That, you know, this theory that it's cultural deprivation that ultimately causes social problems, and you know, education into middle-class norms will fix everything. And throughout the documents, you really see this idea of constructed as colonization as the fall. So cultural disruption is the sort of key problem or cause of problems that's often brought out. And but it's rarely stated that Aboriginal mothers, well, they do kind of state that you lack parenting skills, but they don't say it in a mean way. They say, you know, it's our fault. It's colonization's fault. It's not you. So a good example is discriminatory child welfare policies, shattering intergenerational effects of the residential school system, and the broader impact of colonization all compromise the ability of contemporary Aboriginal women to live out their foundational role as mothers. So it's colonization that undermined, you know, you would be a good parent, but it's our fault, and now we're here to restore things. And so modifying relationships and interactions between parents and children is seen as central to solving social problems. And although they say parents, what they really mean is mothers, and it's really obvious in the sacred space of womanhood that the focus is very much on mothers, but you can see it across the different documents. And in particular, so there's a lot of you know, drawings and that sort of thing, and that's a very common thing because of linguistic divides. But if you look at one of these drawings that was used in, I think, Family is the Focus document, you can literally see the problems are rooted in family. And the wisdom of mothers is the trunk, and then on top of that is policy. So they say that you know, solutions are rooted in the wisdom of mothers, you know, the sacred role of motherhood. But the wisdom of mothers is repeatedly said to have been undermined by colonization. So everything lies with mothers, the solutions are there, but mothers are also cast in profound doubt about their ability to do that. And it's explicitly stated that they can't. Also, culture, the solution. So the solution, if cultural breaks are the cause, then cultural renewal is posited as the solution. But as I said before, the cultural renewal is actually just a globalization of mainstream parenting discourse. So how parents should relate to their children in mainstream culture is the same advice that is given to Indigenous people, but it's just portrayed through this cultural, this sort of globalized form of communication. So you can see like self-esteem, for instance, this residue of self-esteem. Nobody says like the main problem with Aboriginal people is self-esteem, but you can see they talk about identity and confidence in your identity, and the problems are going to come through boosting self-esteem and confidence, and that culture can be a kind of therapy. Now, of course, there's a rational kernel in this. It is quite good to be involved in your culture. You know, we go to sweat lodges, that sort of thing, and it's really nice, and it gives you a sense of meaning in your life, that there's this whole enchantment of the world that's missing from mainstream culture, that was present for me. You know, everything has spirit, that sort of thing, and it enchants your existence. But culture as therapy is posited as a solution to social problems. And that's the difference. It's not just like, oh, let's renew culture because it's meaningful and nice, and that's something that people want, but because it's going to solve problems on reserves. Okay, so I think this is a cautionary tale where the calls for cultural sensitivity actually resolve into a globalization of mainstream Euro-American parenting advice into the language of indigenous cultures. And because it sounds so good, it's very hard to fight against. And it's very hard to see what's actually going on. And people sort of embrace it. It's not our fault, we're traumatized, it goes on and on and on. And material improvement is actually seen as colonization. So what I think, anyway, might actually solve problems, which is control over resources, self-determination, building infrastructure, and that sort of thing, is seen as colonization. Whereas emotion management is seen as decolonization. Yet the focus on strengths and well-being may be a kind of deep colonization. Or you know, drawing on Nicholas Rowe's colonialism hidden within purportedly progressive post-colonial discourses. So I'm using this for emotional well-being. Paratis, I'm not trying to say that, is using it to look at trauma, or what Yang calls kindly power. So what happened is that the rise of the trauma narrative positioned Indigenous people as traumatized and ill by definition. And rather than the strengths-based model, you know, acting as a counter to that, it actually further entrenches this sense that well-being is not something ordinary Aboriginal people possess. It's something that might have been existent in the culture, but that's been undermined and therefore needs to be supported. And therefore there's an invitation to greater intervention into family life. And increased intervention is actually demanded. And I wrote the result is, but I wouldn't say that it's directly causal. There are serious, obviously, social problems, you know, on reserves. But I think that there's increased surveillance that's undoubtable that leads to increased intervention and child removal. Because people are depicted as unable not only to self-determine, you know, never mind control over your community. You can't even care for yourself. You can't even care for your children. So it's not only undermining those long-term goals of self-determination, but also breaking up families in this continuation of the colonial policy of removal of children.